In the summer of 1893, in the hill country of central Texas, where the cedar brakes run thick against red limestone ridges and the sky goes pale as bleached bone by July, a young woman named Marin Lowe stood at the lip of a dry stone well and dropped a rope into the dark. She was 27 years old. She had arrived in the town of Burnt Timber 3 weeks prior with $41 sewn into the hem of her coat, a canvas bag of her father's tools, and a receipt for the purchase of a derelict homestead tract that the county land clerk had handed her with the particular patience adults reserve for children who have not yet understood their mistake. The clerk had not said anything unkind. He had simply slid the deed across the counter, watched her sign it, and then looked away. The property was 7 acres on the eastern bench above Nolan Creek. It had last been occupied in the 1830s when a farming family named Pratt had worked the ground and, by the county assessor's account, vanished. The structures remaining were a stone foundation half collapsed into brush, a cedar post fence line that had mostly fallen, and the well. The well was what Marin had come for. She had not told the land clerk that. She had not told anyone in Burnt Timber anything that mattered. She had walked the property for the first time on a Thursday in late June, when the air along the eastern bench smelled of cedar resin and dry grass, and the creek below ran a thin, clear thread over pale limestone. She had counted paces along the fence line, noted which posts still held, and which had gone to rot at the base, and she had examined the foundation stones one by one, reading their condition the way her father had taught her to read stone, for what it told you about water and freeze and the patience of whoever had laid it. The limestone blocks were set without mortar, fitted close, and they had held for 60 years, without moving more than a few inches at the corners. Whoever had built this house had known what he was doing with stone. The well was at the northeast corner of the foundation, perhaps 30 feet from the old wall line. The coping ring was limestone, fitted close as the foundation, 8 courses of stone rising to knee-height at the tallest point. She walked around it once before she touched it. The ring was intact, no stones missing or shifted out of line. The mortar between courses crumbled to powder in places, but the courses themselves plumb. The wooden cover was long gone, rotted away entirely, and the mouth of the shaft was open to the July sky. She lay flat on the warm limestone cap and looked down. There is a particular kind of knowing that a person carries when they have been taught something by someone who loved them and who is now gone. It does not announce itself. It lives in the hands and in the gut, and it comes awake when the right object is near. Marin had carried her father's knowing for 4 years. She was ready to use it. She had learned the sound from him. Her father, Arne Lowe, had been a well sinker and a water witch of the practical sort, meaning he used neither rods nor dowsing, but rather a weighted rope with a small iron plumb bob fixed at its end, and he listened. He had come from Norway as a young man and had taken up the trade in central Texas because the hill country sat on a limestone karst that behaved differently from any aquifer in Scandinavia, and the learning of it had taken him the better part of a decade. He had taken Marin on his jobs from the time she was 8 years old, and she had learned by carrying rope and handing tools and keeping her mouth shut when he was listening. She had dropped her first plum at the age of 11 on a farm south of New Braunfels, and she had reported to him exactly what she heard, with her eyes closed and the rope loose in her palms, and he had told her she had it right. Every well, he had told her, was a story sealed in stone. The layers of rock told you what the land had been, and the bottom told you what it had kept. If you dropped the plum and heard it strike clay, you would pull up mud and roots, the remnants of a century of fallen leaves. If you heard it strike gravel, you might find the old watercourse that fed the spring, long since gone dry. Limestone gave you a particular dense tap, like knuckles on a tabletop, and you learned to distinguish it from the sound the plum made when it hit standing water, which was a different thing entirely. A soft, heavy answer rather than a strike. And if you heard it strike something that rang, he had said, with the particular stillness he reserved for the things that mattered most, then you pulled it up slowly, and you looked before you touched. He had never in all his years of sinking wells across the hill country and the coastal plain heard a well answer back with metal. Neither had she. She had replayed the sound 3 times in her memory before she accepted that it was what she thought it was. It was what she thought it was. She dropped the rope and heard metal answer back. Not a hollow ring, not the high note of a thin lid or a bucket bale, but a low, flat strike, the sound a fist makes against a full iron chest. She stood very still above the well's opening, the rope lying loose in her palms, and she counted the depth by the rope's knots. 14 feet. The well's original depth, as measured from the lip to the clay shelf above the limestone bed, was approximately 18 feet. Something sat at 14. Maren did not shout. She did not run to town. She coiled the rope, marked the knot count with a piece of chalk she kept in her coat pocket, and went back to the cedar post shelter she had rigged along the south wall of the old foundation, where she had been sleeping on a bedroll for 3 weeks. She ate cold biscuits she had baked that morning at the stone fire ring near the creek. She lit her father's tin lantern and sat with the chalk marks and the rope length and the numbers her father had taught her to trust, and she thought, if you would like to know what she found before this story is done, stay with it. She did not reach it quickly. Nothing honest does. Maren had come to burnt timber because of a letter. The letter had been among her father's papers, which she had sorted in the weeks after his death in the winter of 1889, and she had set it aside then because she was 23 and grieving, and the task of reading everything at once had been beyond her. She had returned to it twice in the years since, and each time she had understood a little more. The letter was dated August 1862 and signed by a man named Elias Pratt. It was addressed to her grandfather, Sigurd Lowe, who had been a well sinker working the central Texas hill country in the years before the war. The letter was written in the careful, slow hand of a man who did not often write, and its contents were plain. Elias Pratt wrote that he had placed certain property, described as tools and documented records belonging to him and his father before him, inside the well on his homestead east of what was then called Burnt Cedar Crossing. He wrote that he had done this in haste, that soldiers of unclear allegiance had come through the valley twice in as many weeks, and that he could not carry the property with him when he left. He wrote that Sigurd Lowe had sunk the well in 1838 and was the only man besides Elias himself who knew its true depth, and that he was riding in trust. He wrote that if he did not return within 2 years, Sigurd should go and collect what was in the well, because it would tell its own story, and that story concerned a wrong done to the Pratt family by men who held deeds they had no right to hold. Elias Pratt had not returned. Sigurd Lowe had died in 1865. The letter had passed with Sigurd's papers to his son Arne, who had folded it and kept it, as men of that generation kept things they did not yet know how to act on, not ready to act and not willing to discard. Arne had died in the winter of 1889. Maren had read the letter in the spring of 1893, read it as carefully as she could, tracing the words her finger over the slow, deliberate handwriting of a man writing in the language of trust and necessity. She had then spent 6 weeks in the county land records at San Marcos, tracing the Pratt homestead before she used the last of her savings to purchase it. The 6 weeks had not been easy. The records from the 1840s and 1850s were in some cases badly deteriorated, and the recording standards of the Republic of Texas Land Office had not been uniform across the territory. She had spent 4 days on one ledger volume looking for the original Pratt Grant before she found a cross-reference that sent her to a second volume, which had been misfiled and sat in the wrong cabinet for unknown years. The tract description in the 1849 deed and the description in the subsequent county deed records for the same parcel did not match at 4 boundary corners, which told her something had been changed in the transcription. She had made careful copies of both descriptions before she left San Marcos. The tract had passed through 4 owners since the 1870s, each of whom had held it briefly and then let it go, finding the soil thin and the structures not worth the repair. Not one of them, as far as Maren could determine from the deed records, had ever attempted to restore or resink the well. To any eye that did not know what Sigurd Lowe had built in 1838, it looked like every other dry stone well in the hill country, a limestone ring above a shaft that had given out. The well had not given out. The aquifer had simply dropped with the drought of the 1860s, and the county records confirmed that most of the shallow wells in the eastern bench had gone dry between 1862 and 1867. The well was dry. What sat at 14 feet was not water. Maren spent the first 3 days after the plum strike working the problem of retrieval without going down herself. Her father had not taught her to go into wells. He had taught her to think before she moved, and she thought carefully about rope, about the shape of the shaft, about what a man in haste in 1862 would have used to lower iron property into a stone well, and what he would have left it sitting on. She had 2 lengths of hemp rope, a set of block tackle her father had kept for lifting pump casings, the 3-jaw iron grab hook that had been his workhorse tool on every well job he had taken, and patience she had learned to treat as a material thing, with weight and edge. On the 4th day she rigged the block tackle to the cedar post she had braced across the well's opening, using 2 additional posts, driven into the limestone margin to steady the crosspiece. She had borrowed a hand-brace auger from the farrier in town, a lean man named Gust who had looked at her rope and tackle without comment and told her the auger was hers to use as long as she brought it back clean. She had also bought from the dry goods counter at the commission house a half-pound of beef tallow, which she worked into the rope at the friction points to keep the block tackle running free. Her palms were dark with tallow and rust color by the time she had the rig set to her satisfaction. She lowered the grab hook on her longest rope, working it down in a slow spiral pattern her father had called walking the shaft, letting the hook describe slow circles as it descended so that it would not miss anything resting against the limestone walls. A shaft 14 feet deep and 30 inches across was not spacious, and what sat at the bottom might be pressed against the wall rather than centered. On the first pass, the hook came up with a scrape of loose limestone grit and nothing else. On the second pass, it came up with a wet smell, the old damp of sealed stone that had not seen air in years, and a twist of dried vegetation that must have fallen down the open shaft at some point in the past decade. On the third pass, she felt it catch. She pulled the grab hook up and examined what had come loose. It was a loop of heavy iron chain, oxidized to a deep reddish brown, the links thick enough to have held a wagon tongue. The chain had been used as an anchor to keep whatever lay below from shifting. She lowered the hook again, and this time set it carefully, feeling by rope tension and angle when it had gripped something substantial. She threaded the rope through the block tackle, braced her boots against the limestone margin, and pulled. What came up was a tinderbox of the large variety, the kind a traveling man kept his fire kit in, but this one was iron-sided and sealed with a hasp and lock. It was not large. She could have fit it in her coat pocket. It weighed, she guessed when she had it in her hands, perhaps 6 pounds. The iron had surface rust on every face, and a pale mineral scale along the bottom where it had sat against damp limestone for 3 decades. but it had not opened and had not cracked. She set it on the limestone margin and stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she lowered the grab hook again. The second object was heavier and took her most of an hour. It was a surveyor's satchel. The leather rotted entirely through on one face, the contents having settled into a compressed mass of papers inside a tin liner that the leather had been wrapped around. The tin liner had held. When she lifted the satchel free of the well and set it beside the tinderbox, she could feel through the deteriorated leather that the papers inside were stiff but whole. She did not open either object that day. She covered them with her spare shirt inside the canvas bag, returned the borrowed auger to Gust, and ate supper at the single eating house in Burnt Timber, where the proprietress, a wide woman named Dottie Bess, put a plate of salt pork and cornbread in front of her without being asked. There was another figure in town whom Maren had noted on her second day in Burnt Timber, though she had not yet spoken to him. He was an elderly man, perhaps 70 or a little more, who sat most evenings on the long porch of the old commission house at the end of the main street, and who had watched her pass each time she came in from the property with the particular stillness of a man who recognizes something but is waiting to be certain. His name, she had learned from Dottie Bess, was Cephas Todd. He had been in Burnt Timber his entire life. He had been a boy of 10 when the Pratt family left. She did not approach him. Not yet. The tinderbox took her 2 days to open cleanly. The lock was a simple lever mechanism of the kind a boxmaker would have set in the mid-1840s. A flat steel lever with a single notch that dropped into a catch when the lid was closed, released by a key that turned the lever free of the catch. Without the key, she had 2 paths. She could cut the hasp, which she would not do because the hasp and the lock plate together sealed the gap between lid and body. She could clear the lock pin and move the lever by pick. She worked a thin pick cut from the wire of her father's auger brace into the keyhole over 2 evenings, clearing rust debris by feel, working in small increments and then withdrawing the pick to brush out what she had loosened, fine and slow as pulling a splinter from a child's palm. On the first evening, she cleared perhaps half the rust from around the pin. On the second evening, the lever released and the lid rose. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilskin, now brittle and splitting at every crease, were 3 items. The first was a small silver pocket watch, stopped. The second was a folded document dense with handwritten figures and dates. The third was a deed. She unfolded the deed first, because the handwriting was larger and the paper had held better than the document with figures. It was a land deed for 160 acres in the eastern bench and creek bottom of what was described as the Burnt Cedar Valley in Uvalde adjacent territory, dated September 1849. The grantee was Elias Pratt. The grantor was the Republic of Texas Land Office, and the deed was signed and sealed in the proper form. The land it described included the 7 acres Maren had purchased, all the creek bottom for a 1/4 mile on either side, and the ridge above it to the east. She sat for some time with that. 160 acres. She had purchased 7 of them, the parcel that had sat unoccupied long enough for the county to reduce the assessed value to almost nothing. The remaining 153 acres had been bought and sold several times over since the 1860s, some of the creek bottom now under cultivation by a family named Wick, who had come from Germany in the 1870s. Some of the ridge sold off in small parcels to various buyers, whose names she did not know. The land was not empty. It had people on it who had paid for it and worked it and called it theirs. She set the deed carefully on the oilskin, smoothing the paper flat at the creases where it had been folded, and she sat looking at it until the lantern needed oil, and she got up to fill it. The second document, the one with figures, took longer to read. Her father had taught her basic survey notation and land measurement, and some of what she read made sense in those terms. But the figures were not survey notes. They were a careful accounting, written in two hands, the first in the same slow, deliberate script as Elias Pratt's letter to her grandfather, and the second in a tighter, more practiced hand that she did not recognize. The accounting set out, column by column, a series of land transactions in the burnt Cedar Valley between 1855 and 1861, with seller, buyer, acreage, stated price, and one additional column labeled simply instrument. In that column, beside each transaction where the instrument was listed, she read the same name repeated across 14 entries: H.C. Garvey, Land and Claims Agent, San Antonio. The accounting was not complete. It was broken off mid-entry as though Elias Pratt had been writing it when he was interrupted. But what it showed across the 14 entries was a pattern. The same agent had brokered the sale of the same parcels twice, sometimes 3 times, to different buyers. The original sellers, those who had taken Republic of Texas land grants in the 1840s, appeared once in the ledger and then never again. The second buyers, the buyers who appeared in the county deed books as current holders in 1861, had paid Garvey's office. The original deed holders had never been paid at all. Maren had enough knowledge of how land transfers worked to understand what she was reading. The grants had been sold from underneath their holders, the signatures forged, or the documents suppressed, and the proceeds had gone to an agent who had operated for 6 years across the valley before the war overtook everything and the records scattered. She sat outside her canvas shelter in the July heat with the deed and the accounting in her lap and the tin lantern burning low, and she thought about Elias Pratt, who had put these things in a well when soldiers came down the valley road, and who had never come back to claim them. She thought about what 60 years in an iron box at the bottom of a dry well does to an injustice. It does not dissolve it. It waits. That was when she walked to the long porch of the commission house and sat down beside Cephas Todd. He did not speak first. Neither did she. They sat for a few minutes in the cooling, early evening air, and then he said, without looking at her, that he had been wondering when she would come over. She asked him about the Pratt family. He had known them as a boy, he said, speaking carefully in the way of a man who had thought about something for a long time and was choosing which part to begin. Elias Pratt had been a steady man, a fair neighbor, not given to quarrel. He had worked the creek bottom land with 2 horses and grown corn and kept hogs. When the soldiers came through in the early part of the war, he had sent his wife and children south to her people and gone with them, meaning to come back. He had not come back. The rumor in Burnt Timber when Cephas Todd was a young man was that Elias Pratt had died of fever in 1865, somewhere below San Antonio. There had been children. A son, he thought, grown by now if living, old. She told him what she had found in the well. She did not show him the documents yet. She described them. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he had always thought there was something wrong with how the land in the Eastern Bench had changed hands, but that he had been a boy when it happened, and then a young man with no legal standing, and then a man who understood that some things were beyond what a single person could argue in a county courthouse in the 1870s. He said this without bitterness, in the flat, factual tone of someone who has accepted a thing because there was no alternative. He said it again. He had always thought there was something wrong. She told him she would need help finding Elias Pratt's descendants. If a son had lived, and if that son had children, the deed was theirs. The accounting was theirs. What could be done with them at this distance of years was a question she could not answer alone. But the property and the record belonged to whoever carried Elias Pratt's line forward. Cephas Todd said he had a second cousin in Castroville who had known Elias Pratt's son, whose name was Daniel, and that Daniel had settled somewhere in the hill country below Kerrville in the 1870s. He said he would write a letter. He sat looking at the creek bottom below them in the cooling air for a moment longer, and then he said that he had been watching her come and go from the old Pratt place for 3 weeks, and that he had figured out by the second week that she was not in burnt timber to farm. She told him she was a well sinker, among other things, that her grandfather had sunk the Pratt well in 1838. He was quiet again. Then he said that made sense. He said that the well had always been a fine piece of work for its time, that people in town had talked about it when he was young, that Sigurd Lowe had set the coping ring in 2 days flat and plumbed the shaft to 18 feet in 4 more. He said he had not known Sigurd Lowe himself, only known of him by the well he left behind. There is a thing that happens sometimes when two people discover they are in possession of different pieces of the same story, and neither of them has been able to use their piece alone. Cephas Todd had one piece, the memory of a family that left and did not come back, the ambient conviction across the decades that something had been wrong with how the land changed hands. Marin had the other piece, a letter, a plumb bob, and a tinderbox pulled from 14 feet of dark stone. Together, the pieces made something that neither of them could have assembled without the other. He would write the letter to Castroville that night, he said. She should come by the commission house the day after tomorrow, and he would have a copy for her to read before he sent it. She said she would. What followed took most of the summer and part of the autumn. Marin stayed on the Pratt homestead and worked it methodically as she had worked the well. She engaged the county surveyor to remark the original grant boundaries from the 1849 deed, which placed the entire creek bottom and the eastern ridge inside the Pratt original grant and outside the subdivided parcels that had been sold by Garvey's office in the 1850s. The surveyor was a young man named Felix Reyes, who had recently taken the county appointment, a precise and careful man who used a transit level that he kept wrapped in cloth against the dust, and who never set a stake without checking it twice. He came out to the eastern bench on a Wednesday morning with his instrument and his chain, and he spent 2 days retracing the boundary descriptions from the 1849 deed against the existing terrain, calling out measurements to Marin, who held the chain rod and recorded figures in the notebook she carried in her coat. At the end of the second day, Felix Reyes sat on the limestone coping ring of the well with the 1849 deed in one hand and the accounting document in the other, and read through the figures column by column with the focused quiet of a man doing arithmetic in his head. Then he said that the county land records were going to need a careful look. He said it calmly, without drama, the way a man states a professional conclusion that has implications beyond his immediate authority to address. He rolled the documents carefully and handed them back to her and said he would file a surveyor's notation with the county records, citing the boundary discrepancy and the documents she had provided. It would not resolve anything by itself, he said, but it would be there in the record. She wrote to the General Land Office in Austin, enclosing copies of both the deed and the accounting. She wrote a plain letter, stating the facts in the order she had found them, naming the documents and where they had been recovered. She did not accuse anyone. The men who had done this were long dead. She described what the documents showed, what the accounting demonstrated, and what the original 1849 grant established about rightful ownership. She asked for guidance on the process of restoration. Cephas Todd's letter to Castroville produced, after 6 weeks, a reply that came not from Castroville but from a small town southeast of Kerrville. Daniel Pratt had died in 1887, but his daughter, a widow named Ruth Greer, was living. She was in her 40s, had 3 grown children, and had never heard the name of the Eastern Bench Grant. Her father had spoken of his people's land in the burnt Cedar Valley only as something lost in the confusion of the war, too tangled and too old to pursue. She had believed him. Ruth Greer came to Burnt Timber in September. She had traveled from outside Kerrville by wagon with her youngest son as far as Comfort, and from Comfort she had come the rest of the way alone, arriving on a Tuesday morning when the summer heat had finally begun to thin, and the cedar smell on the eastern bench was sharp as iron in the early air. She was a compact, steady woman, perhaps 45, with her father's careful way of moving, deliberate and economical, the way of someone who had worked hard all her life and did not waste motion. She had dark hair going gray at the temples, worn plainly back, and she wore a traveling dress of brown wool, worn thin at the elbows. She looked at the old foundation, at the canvas shelter, at the repaired fence line along the south boundary, and she looked at the well, and she did not say anything for a long moment. She sat at the cedar table Maren had built from salvaged postwood, inside the old foundation's restored south wall, and Maren put the documents in front of her one at a time and let her read in silence, the deed first, and then the accounting. It took her close to an hour to read them both, going back over the accounting figures more than once, tracing the column of instrument names with her finger. When she looked up, she had the expression of a person who has been told something they already half knew and had stopped expecting to be confirmed. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter and heavier than surprise. She said simply that her father had always believed the land was taken. He had just not known how to say it plainly to anyone with the power to do anything about it. She asked how Maren had known to look. Maren told her about the letter. She told her about her grandfather and her father, and the plumb bob and the rope, and the sound that a well makes when something metal is resting at the bottom of it. Ruth Greer listened without interrupting, and when Maren was done, she said that it was a long way to come on a letter 60 years old and $40 in savings. Maren said her father had taught her to see things through. Ruth Greer said her father had taught her the same thing, though she had not always understood what it would cost. Maren told her what the General Land Office had written back. The original grant was validly documented. The subsequent transactions showed instruments that could not be authenticated against the original signatories, several of whom appeared in the county records as deceased before the dates on the Garvey transactions. The office had opened a review. It would take time. These things always took time. The land would not be simply handed back, because land in the hill country had changed hands many times since 1861, and innocent parties had bought and paid for what they thought they owned. The process would settle debts, not punish the living for the sins of the dead. It was an imperfect resolution. Maren knew that. She had known it since she read the accounting by lamplight in the summer heat. What she told Ruth Greer was this: the documents established that the Pratt family had owned the land and had it taken from them. The record now said so plainly, in a file at the General Land Office in Austin, and it would say so permanently. No one could close the well again. The accounting would stand in the public record as evidence of what H.C. Garvey's office had done to 14 families in the burnt Cedar Valley, and the Pratt family's name would stand at the head of it as the first and most completely documented case. Ruth Greer sat with that for a moment. Then she asked about the watch. Maren had cleaned it carefully over the weeks she had been waiting for the correspondence to resolve. The case was silver, worn to a soft matte finish on the edge where it had been carried in a pocket for years, and it bore no engraving anywhere on the case front or back, no initials, no dedication, nothing that would have identified the owner to someone who found it. She understood why. If the tinderbox had been found by the wrong hands in the 1860s, no inscription on the watch would have served Elias Pratt or anyone of his blood. The movement was a common grade of Swiss lever escapement, standard for a working man of the 1840s and 1850s, the kind sold by the thousands through dry goods establishments and land agents from Houston to San Antonio. The mainspring had weakened with age, but not broken, and the pivot arbors had surface corrosion she had worked out over several sessions with a sharpened cedar stick and a piece of soft chamois. She had oiled the pivots with a small drop of the clock oil her father had kept for fine mechanisms, the same oil he used for the escapement pivot on his pocket watch when it ran slow. And the watch had run for 11 days before the mainspring needed winding again. It was a working watch. It had been waiting to be wound. She set the watch in Ruth Greer's hands and said nothing. Ruth Greer held it for a long time without opening the case. Then she opened it and looked at the stopped hands, which Maren had not moved. 11:30. Whether morning or evening, summer or winter, 1862 or 1893, she could not say. And it did not matter. The hands were where Elias Pratt had left them. The Land Office review concluded the following spring in March 1894. The formal finding established the validity of the 1849 Pratt grant, named the Garvey transactions as irregularly documented, and settled a compensatory payment drawn against county funds that had accumulated from the subsequent resales. The payment was modest. The sum the county assessor calculated as the fair value equivalent of the Creek Bottom's agricultural use over the 60 years it had been held in error. It was not a fortune. Ruth Greer used it to pay off the mortgage on her house outside Kerrville. The 7-acre parcel with the well on it, being the portion that had not been resold and had sat vacant since the 1870s, reverted to the Pratt estate by operation of the land finding. Ruth Greer's oldest son, a man named Calvin, came to Burnt Timber in the early autumn of 1894 and sank a new well casing into the original shaft, widening the bore and lining it with newer cement forms. The aquifer had recovered in the wetter years of the late 1880s. Water came up at 11 feet. Calvin Greer put a proper casing head on it and a wooden cover and a working windlass, and he stood back and looked at what his great-grandfather had dug in 1838 and said that it was a good well. He was right. It was a very good well. Maren had known that when she heard the rope come taut at 14 feet, when she had understood that whatever sat at the bottom of a dry shaft for 60 years had not moved, had not rusted through, had not surrendered to the limestone and the time. She had known it in the particular way her father had taught her to know things, not by guessing, but by listening. She stayed in Burnt Timber through the autumn of 1894 and into the following winter. She helped Cephas Todd, whose sight had begun to fail him, sort the commission house records that no one else had looked at in 20 years, and she found among them 4 additional deeds that bore the name of Garvey's agency and the same irregularities the accounting had documented. She sent those to Austin as well. She did not stay to see what the Land Office made of them. She had started the thing. Others would carry it. By the spring of 1895, she was gone from Burnt Timber, moving west toward the Edwards Plateau country, where there was surveying work and well-sinking contracts, and where the ground held its secrets in the limestone and the cedar, and the deep-cut draws that the rain had carved over centuries. She carried her father's tools in the canvas bag she had brought from the north, the plumb bob on its rope, the auger brace, the grab hook worn bright on its working edge, the tin lantern with a fresh wick. She did not carry the watch. That had belonged to a man who had put his most careful things into a stone well in the summer of 1862, and trusted that someone who knew how to listen would come. She had come. The well on the Pratt homestead still draws water. Calvin Greer's son inherited the parcel when Calvin died in 1921, and the son's daughter after him, and so on, down the years through the Greer line until the present day. The windlass cover was replaced at some point, and the casing head updated, and a stock tank was added in the 1940s when the ranch expanded. The stone ring Sigurd Lowe set in 1838 is still there below the cement work, gray limestone fitted without mortar, the way a man built things when he expected them to last. It has not moved. It is holding. If you have ever found something that someone trusted to the ground and the dark, something they could not carry but could not bear to lose, leave a word below. She would have understood that. There is another story waiting, one told in the same patience and the same grave attention, if you would like to stay for it. This story draws on the documented practices of frontier well sinking in Central Texas and the recorded patterns of land fraud in the Hill Country and surrounding territories during the antebellum and Reconstruction periods. The characters and specific events are fictional,